The Adulting with ADHD podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. Please see a medical professional if you think you have ADHD or if you have questions about your current treatment. To support this podcast or to access the podcast archives, visit patreon.com/adultingwithadhd. This is the Adulting with ADHD podcast, self-empowerment for people with ADHD.
Today, I'm happy to have with me Alexander Petrovnia, based out of State College, Pennsylvania. Alex is a writer and activist. He also is a trans man with ADHD who is here to share his experience with us today. Nice to have you, Alex. How's it going?
Going great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. We have a lot of listeners who write in questions about the trans experience and ADHD. And so I'm really appreciative that you're here today to share at least your personal experience. I'm going to jump right into it. I had my questions pulled up and now they're gone.
It's okay. I was just pulling up your questions also. This is an ADHD podcast and we are proving it.
We're just staying on brand. That's all we're doing. It's totally on brand here. But I do this every single interview. I hate having tabs open and I'll close them and then it's, oh, I needed that. There we go. Okay. So I set the interview up for context. Tell us a little bit about your transition story. And you can also tell us a bit about your ADHD diagnosis story, because I'm sure they fit together.
Yeah, they actually parallel each other in some really interesting ways. I think there's like a lot of comparisons that can be drawn between them in terms of that something is up, something is, and once you realize what it is, it all starts clicking and you look back and you go, oh, that's why. And for me, that was almost even more pronounced because I self-realized my transness about the same time that I self-realized my ADHD, like within a month of each other. And
oh, wow.
Oh, yeah, it was a lot for sure. It was an interesting time. It was also right during the very beginning of the pandemic. Basically, I suspected I probably had ADHD and I suspected I was probably trans and I was avoiding dealing with either thing.
Yeah.
Full disclosure, I do not recommend that. Do not endorse that. Don't do that. It will hurt and it won't work also. But then I was trapped in quarantine with nothing but my own thoughts. And I just got to a point where I was like, okay, I guess this isn't going away. So I'm going to do something. And I managed to, I'm very lucky and very privileged that I was able to get a ADHD diagnosis within about 6 months or so. Yeah. And so that really helps. My Adderall prescription or whatever is definitely not up to snuff because I have some psychiatric issues and they are using that to say that I might be at risk for selling them, which is ableist as hell, but that is how it is. Yeah. And then so with me transitioning, I had suppressed my knowledge that I was trans. I had come out to myself, which almost any trans person will tell you is a huge, I think honestly, that's the most important coming out moment, which sounds, but it's true. To myself probably dozens of times actually in almost a decade. I probably knew I was trans at least the first time I remember, thinking about that very clearly. I was about 13 or 14. And I just was not in a situation where I could deal with that. And so my solution being air quotes for sure, was to just suppress that. And I just did that over and over and over. And honestly, I don't know if I would still be that way and still be just miserable and not living my life. I don't know where I would even be, except that my current partner, my fiance actually, when I came out to him, very early on in our relationship, we were together about a month. He was like, okay, I believe you. And I'm going to find out what we can do about this. And I'm going to find out how I can help you. And he wouldn't let me recloset myself. And that sounds, he hates when I phrase it that way because that sounds controlling. And I'm like, no, it was so the right thing. And you knew I didn't want to do that. But I felt like I had no options. And he gave me some support and some option to be able to do that. And then a couple months later, he came out as trans also. So that is interesting. And we've been transitioning together, which is strange and honestly so beyond wonderful, because doing this at all is very frightening, and doing it alone would be even more frightening. So cheers to anybody doing it at all. And but yeah, those were very, very interconnected for me. And then I guess for just some details, I've been out now for almost 2 years, but I've been highly interested. I was a really great ally for quite a long time. And I say that in air quotes,
Oh yeah.
where I was super interested in trans issues, and I've been active with the trans community for the better part of a decade. I've had very close friends who were trans, and I'm arranged their appointments and helped them with their injections and helped them with the legalities of getting their name changed. So it's odd for me because I am, an activist on trans issues, and I say I've been out for 2 years, and people go, "Wow, that's not a very long time." And I go, "Yeah, but I've been doing this not on behalf of myself for quite a long time, and it took a while for me to be able to prioritize myself in that way." But yeah, and then I have been on HRT for, it'll be a year next month. Woo, exciting. And
Wow.
yeah, it's super exciting. And then I was very, very lucky to be able to get top surgery about a month ago.
Wonderful. That's great. It's a lot of progress since lockdown when this kind of all culminated. That's a lot. A lot of people I've talked to have gone through transformations of some sort or other during lockdown, I guess, being forced to sit with yourself for a while, bring some stuff out. It sounds like a lot of people have been having that experience. How did that HRT work for you when we're talking about ADHD symptoms? Did you have any sort of, I guess it was all happening at the same time for you?
So I actually got Adderall about 6 months before I got HRT. So there was some latency here. And so I could almost observe the effects. And the other thing is that I'm a biologist, and my interest is I'm a biologist by training, and my interest is in water quality and drinking water safety, which means I know a fair amount of toxicology and medical things. So I paid a lot of attention to this because I thought it was just very interesting. It's very interesting to me to see how these things interact. And I guess the main thing that I've come away with is that it's very clear that human beings are not the sum of our parts. We are this deeply interconnected system, and any little thing that is wrong, whether it be mental, whether it be physical, whether it be like psychological or emotional, it will all impact each other. And so for me, when I first got my Adderall prescription, it was too low of a dose, and I know that obviously helped a lot, and that helped me be able to get my HRT because it helped me be able to get my affairs in order, which was a huge deal. And then the other thing that when I went on HRT with that, even though my dosage of Adderall did not change, it became much, much more effective because there was just so much less interference. And there was what I call the big shift, which I've talked to a lot of trans people and a lot of trans people who have been on HRT. And I've noticed about half or a little over half describe this experience that shortly after you start HRT, about, I don't know, maybe about a month in or whatever, there's this very sudden change in just how you feel and perceive the world. And suddenly you're like, it's going to be okay. Everything is okay. And it is the strangest, like, it is so difficult to explain. It is the closest thing to a supernatural or miraculous experience I've ever had, but it really is. And I think, at least for me, and I presume for some other people as well, there is some part of, I guess, your psyche or even your physical brain that quote unquote knows that what brain chemistry it will expect. And so when you get the correct brain chemistry, there's, I think, this part of some people's brains, some trans people's brains, that just sighs in relief and is, oh my goodness, this is how it's supposed to be. And I've talked to a lot of other trans people and they've experienced this as well. And it's one of the very first things that happens. And it went from me feeling like every little difficulty in my life was overwhelming. Oh my gosh, I'm trans and I have ADHD and life is ending and the world is over, to me being okay. This is a problem. but we're going to work on how to fix it. And I can do this. And it just grounds you and gives you so much more self-confidence to even approach the tasks without getting panicky, which is a huge difficulty in my ADHD for me, is just I get so overwhelmed.
I can't imagine the executive function required to go through a transition. That in itself. I've been through pregnancy, but this sounds like next level, like a lot of things to coordinate here. It sounds like.
Yeah, a lot of things are changing. There's a lot of moving parts, particularly with HRT and hormones. Your hormone balance impacts things that you will never expect until you've experienced it. The human body is fascinating, and the systems that interact are fascinating. And for me, every single change has been positive for me, and every single change has been affirming for me, which has been fantastic. But there are very ridiculous, absurd things that I would have never seen coming. I guess one that I like to tell a funny story a little bit about is that my spice tolerance has gone substantially up. I used to be like, isn't that the strangest thing? I never would have expected this. But I used to be like the one in the friend group that people would mock because I couldn't handle buffalo sauce without my eyes watering. And I was aware of it. And then shortly after I got on HRT, I cooked dinner for myself and my roommates, and I made this spicy chicken that usually isn't very spicy, because the way that I spiced it was I spiced it as much as I could physically handle, and then it was perfect for everyone else. And I did this, and it was inedible. None of them could eat it, and they were like, "What have you done? Why have you done this to us?" And I didn't even realize. And meanwhile, I was just sitting there eating it, and I was like, "What do you mean? This is pretty good." I thought and so there.
It's hilarious.
I'm glad you think so. Then we had to order pizza.
Wow.
But the strangest things will happen in terms of interacting with that. But yeah, there are so many things, and life doesn't really cut you and people don't really cut you a break, because you were comparing it to pregnancy, and there's a lot of hormonal and physical changes in pregnancy as well. Most people understand what pregnancy is. And most people, if you go, "Hey, I'm pregnant, could you give me a little bit of slack?" or "I'm going to need some time," most people would be like, "Oh, congratulations, that's great." A lot of times, I'm so sorry, the construction behind me. A lot of times people don't even know what transition means. They don't know what HRT means, because transition doesn't just mean medical transition, but any transition, whether it be social, medical, internal, psychological, has a huge amount of moving parts, and a huge amount of things are changing. But people don't really get you a break, and you can't really ask for a break without outing yourself. And depending on who you are, that's really difficult and really dangerous in some cases. And so on an executive function level, it's very difficult, but also
emotional.
It's emotional, both in terms of this is an incredible thing happening in your life, and emotional in terms of, oh my gosh, your hormone balance is swinging wildly in many directions. The other, I guess, the thing that I'd like to, since you say people ask you about this, the thing that I wasn't expecting and that I had to learn to work around is that most HRT, when you start on a dosage. If you do injection HRT, you start on a dosage where you take your dosage once a week. And so in a system without injectable HRT or additional medication, your hormone balance is constant, because your body is constantly adjusting, right, to where it thinks it should be. And that's a whole system in the body to do that and to keep that stable. When you inject it once a week, it is not stable. You get one giant peak, and then it goes downhill from there. And so it's very rough. It's very difficult. And it got to the point for me where in the first dosage or whatever, right at the beginning of the week, my executive functioning was fantastic, and I felt good about life, and everything was great. And then by the end of the week, I would stub my toe and start crying, because my hormones were just so mad. And what you can do, and I want to let people know that you can do, is you can ask your doctor to take smaller doses more frequently. And especially if you have ADHD, I would highly recommend that.
Wow, that is a gold mine of advice here these last few minutes. Wow. Yeah, totally. I'm pausing because that's just so valuable. Like,
when I figured that out, it was like, it changed my life because it really was that I had to front load all my work because I couldn't get anything done in the second half of the week. And of course, my job did not like that at all.
Something that's brought me comfort is just knowing that there is affordable private online therapy available anytime and anywhere through BetterHelp. And I just found it to be way more convenient and way more in line with how I prefer to communicate. There's ways to communicate through email, through chat, through phone, whatever is easier for you. And listeners of the Adulting with ADHD podcast can save 10% off their first month today if they sign up. To take advantage of this deal, go to betterhelp.com/ADHD adulting. That is BetterHelp, HELP.com/ADHD adulting.
Absolutely. And to your point earlier, we don't necessarily all have jobs where we can ask for the support we need as a trans person. To a smaller degree, ADHD, but I imagine to a much larger degree as a trans person. So that's incredible because while you were talking about the month, was it weekly or monthly that the injections were?
Weekly.
Jeez. When you were talking about that, I was thinking about our monthly cycle dip that a lot of us recognize for menstruation and how it screws everything up. But to go through that once a week?
Yeah, it was as somebody who I have uterus, I've been menstruation issues for sure. I actually have endometriosis as well.
Oh, wow.
Not really diagnosed, but
yeah,
you know how that goes. It's one of those diagnoses very difficult to get, and I haven't gone for that. But so the hormone issues around that are even more pronounced, and my fluctuation with my testosterone wearing off was so much worse than any PMS I'd ever experienced in my entire life. Before that, it was a low T issue. And you see all those commercials or whatever about elderly men often have low T and they just, are miserable and dysfunctional and hate everything. And when I went into this process, I was like, okay, I'm sure they're just being a little dramatic. No, not at all. The world is ending at all times.
Everything. And I think that's part of why I chose this topic is because just culturally hormones are seen as funny, that person's having a hormonal event or whatever. Funny, it's not like a big deal. We don't see a lot of representation in medical studies. You're a biologist, you know all about this. And it's no joke at all. It is not funny. And it can in fact be very serious. To your point, once a week of going through that's a lot to go through.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And for me and for many other trans people, being marginalized systemically is a traumatizing experience. And we know this, and we know that being marginalized and or being closeted, even if you aren't socially marginalized, just being closeted is a traumatizing experience. And we know that these lead to a lot of mental health concerns. And for me, when I was on the lower end of my testosterone, my mental health issues would just spiral out of control. And it was horrible. Yeah, once a week for the second half of the week. And it was like nothing I've ever experienced before. And I was not prepared for it. And I'm really glad I get the chance to educate people about that because one, that commingled with my ADHD in some really unfortunate ways.
Yeah.
For sure. Executive functioning went to nothing. Nothing could be done for the second half of the week. So I had to front load all my work weeks. And I was lucky that I had the ability to do that because I was making my own work schedule at that point.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then the other aspect of it is that nobody warns you. And there's not a lot of reliable information about how HRT impacts people, partially because of what you said, where there's not a lot of studies and hormones are considered this flippant issue, which is absurd. And partially because of transphobia in medicine, that trans people aren't really studied. And a lot because even your doctor doesn't really know because there's none of this research. And so you just end up hearing from other trans people and hoping for the best. And so that was the biggest thing I wasn't expecting, but which makes total sense in retrospect. I take my injections twice a week. Infinitely better, no longer a problem. I get to have that first half of the week, like everything functions and I'm feeling good and I know I can solve problems and I know I can get through these things. I get to have that all the time because that's the person I actually am.
And
It's an immense privilege, and it helps with everything, absolutely everything.
all the work that has to be done to get there. And it sounds so straightforward, as you said, in retrospect. And I think we talk about that a lot on this podcast. It's okay, come on, doc. It's not trickling down to the medical providers. And it's just so frustrating, at least from the estrogen perspective. There's studies that are more than 20 years old that have documented the way this works and the relationship between estrogen and mental health. We shouldn't be learning about our health on Twitter and TikTok and just talking to friends. Like, that shouldn't be how, but that is what's happening. I never would have received hormonal treatments if I hadn't have been on Twitter and just been talking to people.
Oh, absolutely. With ADHD, I figured out I had ADHD from Twitter, how I could go about treating it and even just beginning to see a solution for it on Twitter. Yep. I figured out how to work around things and strategies that I could implement from the internet and from the ADHD community there, which is incredible. I love them.
Me too.
But that's not their job, and they don't get paid for that. So that's someone's job, and they're not doing it.
Exactly. And we're not formally trained like Twitter people. Exactly. We're random Twitter people. You are. Exactly. You're a biologist. The medical people out there, I just assumed so much until recently. Everything, the systemic stuff, like you were saying.
Absolutely. And since, we're talking about hormones here, and I do truly believe that hormones have a huge impact on mental health and on executive function and on any kind of neurodivergence specifically. Almost all research operates on the false binary sex model.
Yeah.
And I know people are probably rolling their eyes right now that they're like, oh, he's talking about how binary sex is false. But you have to think about this and realize that what we define as sex is a huge array of different qualities that are not consistent between any two individuals.
Yeah.
And we're deciding that we're putting them into two categories, and we just are not discussing anything else. And the vast majority of medicine is conducted on these assumptions. When they conduct medical studies, they don't say, oh, we tested this in somebody who has a range of this level of testosterone to this level of testosterone over a week. They say, oh, we did this in men.
Yes.
Then if you have an interaction, we have no idea what that's actually caused by. Because say you tried a drug and they said, oh, this drug can cause heart disease. Is that because of estrogen? Is that because of reproductive organs? Is that because of lifestyle choices? Is that because of mistreatment in medicine and misogyny? We have no idea because they just don't bother to do with anything.
Yeah, put our heart.
Just a trans issue. That should make everyone worried.
Yes.
This is a huge issue, and it impacts every person who's going to have a health problem, which is everyone.
Yes. Absolutely. Hence why we're talking today. I'm so happy to have found you, because it's like, what are people talking about this? It just drives me up the wall. But this is the first step. We've got to start talking about it, even in this little tiny pocket of the interwebs. But at least we have this conversation. That actually brings me to my next question. Aside from Twitter, if someone's listening right now who just needs to know what the next step is, do you know of any good resources or organizations or any supports out there?
You mean for transitioning, or do you mean?
Yeah, mostly transitioning, especially from the mental health perspective.
Sure. So transition, that is a tough question because transition care is hugely different depending on where you are. I can mostly speak specifically to the United States.
Okay.
And what I can tell you about in the United States is every state has different laws. Every single one. And sometimes there are no laws, which is sometimes worse because it means that no one has any idea how to deal with it. But what you want to look for, there's these magic words called an informed consent model. The informed consent model means that a doctor can prescribe you HRT if you sign a piece of paper saying, I know the risks of this and I still want to do it. If you don't go through the informed consent model, you have to jump through many more hoops. Literally just searching in Google informed consent model HRT and your state can help so much. There are not a lot of doctors that do this, but if you can find one, it is so much better than just going to your local doctor, because then you have to get psychiatric evaluations, you have to do a bunch of blood work, it's absurd. And I'm very privileged that I, have been in the trans community enough to know about those magic words and to be able to find one of two total doctors in the state of Pennsylvania who operate on the informed consent model.
Wow.
Yes, and they are 3 hours away from me, but telehealth is a miracle.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like you've just dropped some more info bombs here for our listeners. It never even occurred to me that there are specific treatment models that you have to look for. I can't even wrap my brain around how.
No, then there's no way for people to know this.
Exactly.
So many trans people are the only trans person that they know. Because even at the broadest statistics, trans people of any variety, whenever I say trans, I want it to be said, that includes all non-binary identities as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an umbrella term by most people in the community in general.
Well, that's new to me. Thank you for educating me on that. I'm still learning a lot here.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's all good. Yeah. So, transgender can mean binary transgender people and non-binary transgender people. Yeah. So many trans people are the only trans person that they know. And a lot of, basically at the highest possible estimates, trans people are about 3 to 4% of the total population. And so there aren't a lot of us, just statistically, there aren't a ton of us. And if you particularly live in a more rural region, it's very difficult to find other trans people, because in addition to there just not being a lot of us, there's probably not a lot of trans people that are out or who have access to the information to even understand that they're trans.
Yeah, that sounds statistically very similar to the ADHD community too. So imagine being at the intersection of both of those very small, tiny groups that are often underserved in the medical space. That's incredible. And like that percentage you were talking about, those are people who know or are identifying as that, but not necessarily people who haven't really figured it out yet.
The estimations of all people who would be trans, whether or not they are aware. So that's looking at highly urbanized populations where there's a very low barrier to entry relatively.
Oh,
and
okay. Yeah.
That is the best model that we have to make a broad estimate. And it could be totally wrong. And that's fine.
It's what you got. It's not, there's reams and reams of studies,
That's what we got. And it's totally possible, as you see, that a lot of, particularly with non-binary identities, those are often not recognized until very recently. And so a lot of people are figuring out that they're non-binary, which is awesome. And all of the people trying to panic, there's more and more trans people. No, but more and more people who are trans are able to lead healthier, happier, more fulfilling lives. And that should be something we are all celebrating and facilitating. Absolutely. And that is, again, very similar to the neurodivergent community in general. And I have ADHD, and so I know it from the ADHD perspective, where people are like, oh, every kid has ADHD now. And I'm like, no, everybody who has ADHD, more people who have ADHD are able to recognize it and acknowledge it and get support for it. And that's fantastic.
Yeah, it should be celebrated. Yeah.
The same thing happens between neurodivergence and being trans, where there's quite a few people who go to eugenicist arguments to try to eliminate it, when you realize it's just a natural variation in the population. And just because it is different and a different way of being than what people consider to be standard, quote unquote, doesn't mean it's in any way bad or wrong. It just means that the systems that are built around us have been constructed too rigidly. And they've been constructed that allow for no variation whatsoever. And that's absurd, because humans are widely variable in many ways. And so the more that we allow for flexibility for things like neurodivergence or things like being trans, the more that the average person can actually be an authentic and supported version of themselves as well. And that's where it drives me crazy that there aren't more people who realize that these issues are, one, so interconnected, and two, so important to the general population. Even if you aren't neurodivergent, or even if you aren't trans liberation and the acceptance of neurodivergence will help you as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. The humanitarian issue. Yeah.
Exactly.
Being able to just exist in your own skin, it shouldn't be such a radical concept.
Yeah, or to just access medical care.
Oh gosh, now you're just talking crazy. Okay.
Well, that's so much commonality between, ADHD and being trans is that some people want medical care and some people don't, and both are perfectly valid options.
Yes.
But people should be able to access medical care, and people should be able to access medical care without that medical care coming at the cost of elimination or the cost of, being shamed for the variation that you have.
Yeah.
And that's so often where the medical care is, okay, if you conform, you can get medical care.
Yes.
And that same pressure exists in both communities for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. You've given us a lot to think about today. This has been such a dense, meaty episode in the best way. Like, I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. So this is the part where you tell our listeners what you're up to these days and where they can find you online if they want to connect. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me. This has been an opportunity. You can find me on Twitter at Alex Petrovnia, spelled Petrovnia, bit odd. Or you can find me on Medium, where I write articles about trans issues and about disability issues and some science sometimes, which is exciting. Yeah, it is. I can be on medium.com also under Alexander Petrovnia. And if you are interested in helping me, I'm currently putting together a group to organize on behalf of the anti-trans, on behalf of, resisting the anti-trans legislation that's going through in the US right now. And particularly looking at people who are willing to categorize and do research for information to make lists of different state level politicians and how they have voted on trans issues in the past so that people can make more informed decisions about this. So if you're interested in working with me on that, please feel free to DM me on Twitter and I will do my best to get back to you. My DMs are a little bit of a mess, but that's what I am mostly up to in terms of activism right now.
Awesome. And I'll also include all these links in the show notes for those of you listening. Alex, thank you again so much. It was wonderful talking with you today.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Hey guys, I'm here to ask a little favor. So, in order to grow the podcast even more, it's come to my attention that I should probably survey you guys to get a better idea of who's actually listening and what you guys want and what you don't want. If you could, pretty please, go to adultingwithadhd.com/survey. It would help me immensely to have this information, not just for myself as I'm creating content, but for any potential partners who may want to help grow the show. I would like to find people who are exactly right for you guys. Thank you very much, and until next time, happy adulting.